Late at night in Chicago, a police cruiser barrels toward the hospital, lights flashing, sirens screaming. One of the officers inside has been shot. The moment they arrive, nurses race him into surgery and page Paul Kersey, the hospital's top trauma surgeon. Paul hands off another procedure to a colleague and hurries to the operating suite, only to find he's too late. The officer has died on the table. The following morning, Paul sits down to breakfast with his wife, Lucy, and their teenage daughter, Jordan, who has just been accepted to a New York college. After eating, they drive to Jordan's soccer match. From the sidelines, Paul and Lucy cheer enthusiastically, but another father keeps erupting over every referee call, shouting insults. Paul asks him, politely, to pipe down, which triggers an argument. The man squares up, ready to get physical. Lucy steps between them, guiding Paul away, and the angry dad calls Paul a chicken as they walk off. After the game, the family meets Paul's brother, Frank, at a pizza place. Frank asks to borrow $2,000, and Paul agrees. Frank then jokes loudly about Paul's high salary, loud enough for valet attendant Miguel to overhear. Miguel also notices the family mentioning they'll be out that night. While retrieving their car, he snaps a photo of the home address displayed on the navigation screen. That evening, the Kerseys prepare to go out for Paul's birthday celebration. Lucy and Jordan present him with an expensive watch. Just then, the hospital calls. An emergency requires Paul's immediate attention. Reluctantly, he postpones dinner and heads to work. Lucy and Jordan decide to do some grocery shopping instead. When they return home with bags in hand, a suspicious van is parked half-hidden around the corner. Jordan heads upstairs to call her girlfriend, and Lucy starts baking a birthday cake. Neither notices a shadowy figure slipping behind a doorway. A sudden draft rustles Lucy's cookbook, flipping pages, odd because the window should be shut. Investigating, she sees muddy footprints. Realization dawns. Someone is inside the house. Lucy shouts for Jordan to come downstairs, but it's too late. A masked intruder lurking in Jordan's bathroom grabs her as she tries to flee. Dragged into the living room, Jordan sees there are 3 robbers in total. The leader threatens to kill her unless Lucy cooperates. He forces Lucy to the safe and makes her empty its contents, jewelry, cash, valuables, into a bag. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, one robber warns his partner to stop playing with a chef's knife and sets it on the counter before stepping outside to look for rope. Left alone with Jordan, the knife-wielding thug uses the moment to harass her, only to halt abruptly when his accomplice returns with the rope. The 2 robbers began bickering, the knife-wielding thug insisting that certain lines should never be crossed. While they argued, Jordan seized the opportunity. She snatched the knife and slashed the man across the face. He howled in pain, prompting his partner to punch Jordan hard and hurl her to the floor. Just then, Lucy returned with the leader. Seeing the chaos, she grabbed a pot of boiling water from the stove and hurled it at one of the intruder's faces. "Run, Jordan," she screamed. The criminals, enraged, opened fire. At the hospital, Paul was midway through surgery when the intercom announced 2 incoming female gunshot victims. He handed his current patient off to a colleague and hurried toward the trauma bay, but other physicians barred him from participating. By the time they told him the truth, Lucy was already dead and Jordan was in surgery. Refusing to believe it, Paul forced himself into the morgue to see Lucy's body with his own eyes, collapsing in grief. Detectives Rains and Jackson soon questioned him, cataloging the valuables stolen from the safe. Frank arrived and lashed out at the officers for ignoring a recent spike in neighborhood crime. Paul calmed his brother, and the detectives assured him they would find the culprits. A nurse then announced Jordan had survived surgery but was in a coma. Paul stationed himself at her bedside. Later, Lucy's father, Ben, delivered the eulogy at her funeral. During the drive back, Ben abruptly stopped his pickup on a dirt road, having spotted something in the brush. Rage flickered in his eyes. He sped to his property, where 2 poachers bolted upon seeing him. Ben leapt out and fired several shots, though the trespassers escaped. Paul watched, stunned, as Ben ranted that the police always arrive too late. Sometimes, he said, a man must act on his own. Then Ben put down the deer the poachers had wounded, ending its suffering with a single shot. Days later, Paul phoned Detective Rains while driving, dismayed to hear there were still no suspects. Frustration boiled over. When a homeless man tried to clean his windshield at a traffic light, Paul shouted at him. He then visited Jordan, finding her girlfriend reading quietly by the bed. Paul thanked her for staying. In the weeks that followed, Paul began therapy. He confessed he couldn't sleep in the master bedroom, choosing the couch instead. He recalled a miserable childhood, riding trains alone to avoid his father, something he'd started doing again, late at night, just to think. Every unfamiliar face on the street conjured images of the men who destroyed his family. He admitted he felt he had failed to protect them. The therapist reminded him that healing is a slow, ongoing process. The days went by in a dull blur for Paul. He spent most of his time reading aloud to Jordan in her hospital room, riding the trains to clear his head, and occasionally trying to connect with Frank. Though more often than not, he simply lay depressed on the couch. Over time, he grew a bit more understanding and eventually handed the homeless man some money to clean his car windows. Weeks passed without any updates on the case, so Paul decided to visit Detective Rains in person. He questioned him about the DNA samples, but Rains explained that they hadn't matched anyone in the system. On the wall behind him, Paul noticed a board filled with dozens of open cases. Only a few had been solved, a visual reminder of the department's lack of resources. That evening, while leaving the train station, Paul saw two men harassing a young woman. He stepped in to tell them off, only to become their target. They beat him up, but at least the girl managed to escape. Later that night, Paul watched television and caught an ad for a local firearms store. The commercial made an impression on him. The next day, he visited the shop, where a clerk showed him an array of weapons. But the process was tedious. Paperwork, a required gun safety course, and security cameras everywhere. Paul told the clerk he'd think about it. Not long after, Paul was at the hospital tending to another gunshot victim. While preparing the body for surgery, a handgun dropped from the patient's clothing. Seizing the opportunity, Paul subtly kicked it under the operating table and later hid it in his clothes before leaving. Once home, he tried firing the weapon for the first time, but the bullet ricocheted dangerously. Realizing how unprepared he was, Paul began dedicating his free time to watching gun tutorials and learning how to handle the weapon properly. After days of practice, his aim finally became passable. One day, Paul was called to the ICU. Jordan had suffered a seizure. Her condition was deteriorating fast, and the chances of survival were low. Seeing her restrained in the bed for her own safety enraged Paul. His daughter was bound, while the criminals who did this were still walking free. Something broke in him. That night, Paul grabbed the hidden gun and walked into a rough Chicago neighborhood with his hoodie pulled low over his face. When he saw two men trying to hijack a woman's car, he yelled at them to stop. The men retaliated by jumping into the vehicle and opening fire. Paul rolled away, avoiding the bullets, and fired back, hitting the driver, who crashed the car. A shard of glass flew off and cut Paul's hand. The second man got out and began shooting wildly. Paul ducked behind another car, waited for his moment, then shot the man in the head. He didn't know that a woman watching from her window had caught the entire scene on video. After firing a second, final shot to ensure the carjacker was down and telling the would-be victim to run, Paul watched the driver's last breath leave his body. He then slipped away, tossing his blood-spattered hoodie into a trash bin and catching a late-night train home. Once there, he disinfected the glass cut on his hand, stitched it with surgical precision, bandaged it, and forced himself to sleep, helped by the sedatives his therapist had prescribed. Even so, vivid dreams of the shooting flickered through his mind. Within hours, detectives Rains and Jackson canvassed the neighborhood for statements. The woman Paul had saved praised her mysterious rescuer, while the neighbor who filmed the incident called the shooter cold-blooded and ruthless. The cell phone clip, already posted online, didn't capture the vigilante's face, but Rains noted a key detail: the gunman's hand was bleeding. The next morning, Paul watched the viral video of himself. Instead of guilt, he felt a jolt of satisfaction, and the nightmares evaporated. News outlets debated whether the unknown Avenger was a hero or a menace. Soon they coined a nickname, the Grim Reaper. At work, Paul covered his injured hand with small bandages to make the wound look minor, shoving it into his pocket whenever police officers passed. That afternoon, a young boy arrived in the ER with a gunshot wound. Paul's gentle bedside manner coaxed the truth from him. He'd been shot by a neighborhood dealer known as the Ice Cream Man. A quick glance at the patient's chart gave Paul the dealer's address. After his shift, Paul swiped a fresh hoodie from the hospital laundry, drove to the boys' rundown block, and spotted the Ice Cream Man lounging beside his pushcart. Paul strode up and shot him without hesitation. As Paul vanished into the shadows, locals descended on the fallen dealer, stripping the cart clean. Detectives arrived minutes later to a chorus of witnesses describing a hooded shooter. Rains watched some kids reenact the event. The lead actor held the toy gun in his left hand. Comparing that detail with the earlier video, Rains deduced the Grim Reaper was likely the same left-handed marksman, and notably unskilled with firearms. By morning, media coverage of the Grim Reaper's second strike saturated every channel. Paul watched, chest swelling with pride. At the precinct, a furious commander berated Rains and Jackson for letting a vigilante run wild, warning that copycats could follow. But the detectives had little to go on beyond the shooter's left-hand dominance and shaky gun handling. Meanwhile, Paul attended another therapy session. The counselor remarked that he looked markedly better. Whatever he was doing, she advised, he should keep it up. Days later, Paul was in the OR when another gunshot victim was wheeled in. His heart jolted. On the table lay Miguel, the valet who had photographed the Kersey address. Paul also spotted his own birthday watch on Miguel's wrist. His surgical efforts lacked their usual urgency. Despite protocol, Miguel died under his care. Afterward, Paul slipped out to the waiting ambulance, lifted Miguel's phone, and used the dead man's fingerprint to unlock it. He also removed the watch from the corpse and retreated to his office, scrolling through Miguel's photo gallery. Disgust churned his stomach when he found a shot of his car's interior. Proof Miguel had scoped out their home. Digging deeper, Paul uncovered an image of a liquor store that doubled as a front for fencing stolen goods. He briefly considered calling Rains and Jackson, but chose to handle it himself. Frank stopped by, hoping to hang out, but Paul canceled their plans, masking the bandaged wound on his hand. That evening, Paul snagged another hoodie from the hospital laundry and headed to the liquor store. Claiming he was a friend of Miguel's, he tried to bluff the owner. The man, however, spotted the hospital tag on Paul's sweatshirt and quietly texted a criminal associate named Fish to come over. Then he reached for a revolver. Paul caught the move in a wall mirror and reacted instantly, pinning the owner's hand with a bar dart and forcing him, at gunpoint, to reveal the backroom safe. Inside, Paul found jewelry, cash, and other valuables stolen from his house. Just then, Fish burst through the doorway and fired. Paul, watching the security monitors, dodged. The bullet struck the store owner instead. Fish unleashed a barrage of gunfire. Paul ducked behind shelves and reloaded. Blood on the floor caused Fish to slip. Paul seized the guitar, smashed it over Fish's back, and toppled a stack of furniture. Fish narrowly rolled clear and retreated to the bar area, but Paul, tracking him on the cameras, shot him in the leg. The wounded thug collapsed. Planting a boot on Fish's bleeding leg, Paul demanded to know who had killed Lucy. Gasping, Fish confessed. A mechanic named Joe. His address was saved in Fish's phone. As Paul bent to retrieve it, Fish lashed out, kicking Paul backward into a shelf. A bowling ball dislodged, crashed on a Fish's skull, and knocked him senseless. Paul seized Fish's pistol and finished him with a single shot. He grabbed the store's security hard drives, but inadvertently dropped his wedding ring on the floor as he fled. Back home, Paul watched an online tutorial and destroyed the drives with a power drill. The next morning, media frenzy over the Grim Reaper reached new heights. Bystanders who'd glimpsed him were trending online. At the hospital, Paul pocketed syringes and medications. Then detectives Rains and Jackson suddenly appeared in his doorway. The detectives showed Paul a photo of Fish, along with a ring they had recovered at the crime scene. Paul identified the ring as his, and the detectives, believing it had been stolen during the home invasion, told him they were making progress in the case. After they left, Paul destroyed Fish's phone. Later, Paul visited Joe at the mechanic shop. He snuck in while Joe was working beneath a car and ambushed him with a wrench, knocking him unconscious. When Joe came to, he found himself tied up under the same car. Paul began torturing him for information. He administered an injection, made a deep incision in Joe's leg, and poured brake fluid into the wound, causing unbearable pain. Joe, writhing in agony, finally confessed that the man who killed Lucy was named Knox, but warned that Knox didn't have an address. You waited for him to come to you. Paul thanked Joe for the intel and untied him. As he left the shop, however, he pulled a chain that released the car's lift, dropping the vehicle directly on top of Joe and killing him instantly. The next day, the detectives paid a visit to Frank. They'd noticed that all of the Grim Reaper's victims were linked to Lucy's murder, and now they wanted to examine Frank's hand to rule him out. Meanwhile, Paul visited Jordan in the hospital and saw a news report about Grim Reaper copycats who were now murdering people and claiming inspiration from the vigilante. At that moment, Paul received a call from Knox. The killer told him to meet at a club in 30 minutes. As Paul left, Frank, growing suspicious, went to Paul's home. When no one answered the door, he let himself in. Down in the basement, Frank found Paul's cache of ammunition and evidence of his tormented, unraveling life. It became clear to him Paul was the Grim Reaper. At the club, Paul sent a text to Knox confirming his arrival. Knox replied, telling him to meet in the bathroom. Paul made his way through the crowded venue and called Knox's number. Hearing the ringtone, he kicked open a stall, only to find a phone left there as a decoy. Suddenly, Knox appeared behind him, using a civilian as a human shield, and opened fire wildly. He had no regard for the crowd and killed multiple bystanders. Paul was injured in the arm and ducked into a stall, returning fire and managing to shoot Knox as well. Then he aimed at the power box and blasted it, cutting the lights. In the chaos, he slipped into the panicked crowd and disappeared. Moments later, the detectives got word of the shooting and headed to the hospital. One of the victims claimed he had seen the shooter, and that man turned out to be Knox. Injured but alive, Knox offered the police numerous details that led them straight to Paul's office. But by the time they arrived, Paul was already gone. Meanwhile, Paul hid inside another hospital room, tending to his newest wound. With no proper medical equipment, he sealed the gash using glue and a stapler, enduring the excruciating pain in silence. Afterward, he returned home and found Frank already waiting for him. Frank immediately confronted Paul, demanding to know how far he was willing to go and how insane he had become. Paul insisted he had no choice. No one else would bring justice. Their tense conversation was suddenly interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. The detectives were at the door. Thinking fast, Frank opened it and told them Paul wasn't there. The officers didn't believe him, but without a warrant, they had no grounds to enter and left. Just then, Paul received a call from the hospital. Jordan was awake. He rushed to her side, and they had a tearful, heartfelt reunion. But joy turned to sorrow when Paul gently told her the truth, that her mother had died. Jordan broke down in anguish, and Paul promised Frank afterward that he would give up the vigilante life now that Jordan was recovering. A week later, Jordan was finally allowed to go home. The detectives came by again to ask her questions, but she couldn't remember anything from the night of the attack. As she and Paul entered the elevator to leave, Knox joined them. Paul kept calm, saying nothing for safety's sake. Knox made small talk with Jordan, then stepped out of the elevator, turning to say he'd see them around. Taking this as a direct threat, Paul returned to the gun store and purchased firearms legally. That evening, Jordan got ready for bed after dinner, but Paul noticed something suspicious outside. He urgently told her to hide under the stairs and call 911. Moments later, an intruder entered through the back door and fired into the bedroom, only to discover it was a decoy made of pillows. A second intruder, drawn by the sound of running water, entered the bathroom and was ambushed by Paul, who shot him in the head. The first intruder came to check the noise, only to walk right into another ambush. Paul, hidden beside the corpse, shot him too, sending his body crashing down the stairs. Suddenly, Paul heard a noise in the basement and went down to investigate. Knox was waiting and caught him off guard, shooting him in the shoulder and knocking him onto the couch. Just then, Jordan emerged from under the stairs and screamed, distracting Knox. Paul used the split-second opening to press a hidden switch on his coffee table, revealing a secret firearm. He grabbed it and, without hesitation, shot Knox dead. When the police finally arrived, Paul explained that he had sustained all his injuries that night and had purchased his firearms legally after Jordan had woken up to protect her. He told them he was ready to relinquish the weapons, hinting that his days as a vigilante were over. Though the detectives were clearly skeptical, they accepted his story and closed the case. Sometime later, Paul dropped Jordan off at her college in New York City, where her girlfriend was already waiting for her. As Paul walked back to his car, he noticed a man steal a bag off a bellhop's cart. Without thinking, Paul called the thief out and pointed at him with a finger shaped like a gun.